posted. It's not flying yet. May not need to be.
All right, Barbara, if you had a chance to look over the minutes from last meeting.
Van, did you get my email from earlier today? Van, did you get the email I sent earlier today?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Just want to make sure you got it.
All right, I'm going to call to order the meeting of the Tallulah Falls Planning and Zoning Commission for June the 10th, 2020. Have each of you been able to look at the agenda for this afternoon?
I have.
All right, Barb. All right. Barb, can I get a motion to adopt the agenda as written? All right, can I have a second? Anybody?
I'll give you a second.
All right. All in favor, raise their hand. All right, good. Thank you. The third item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes from March the 11th. We didn't have a meeting next week. So if everyone's had a chance to look at the minutes from March the 11th, are there any objections to those minutes?
No objection.
Can I get a motion to adopt the minutes as written? All right, in a second.
Second.
All in favor, raise their hand. All right, all in favor. All right, the fourth item on our agenda is the ordinance to regulate short-term vacation rentals. And just stepping in the room is Keith Newton.
You have a pen, it fell out.
I have to mute the cat.
I need to go get a pen.
All right, we'll take a few minutes while Keith has a moment to look at the agenda and the minutes. Keith, I'll give you a moment just to do that. Already accepted them, but I'll give you a moment to look. Be sure to have me sign the minutes because I always forget. I'm always like, get out of here. All right, everyone is in attendance. Okay, what we're doing today is conducting a public hearing on the draft ordinance that we have comprised, the ordinance to regulate short-term vacation rentals in within the city limits of Tallulah Falls. Tressa, you had a chance to look over that ordinance, Stan?
Yes, I have.
Before we invite the public to have comment on that draft ordinance, Tressa, do you have anything you want to say?
I think the changes that we had discussed the last time were actually made.
Yes, yeah, I can't recall exactly what those were, but I think we did make those changes. Dan, do you have any comment on the draft ordinance?
I do not at this time.
Keith? Barbara?
Yes, when you say city limits, is that all of Tallulah Falls, Hickory Nut Mountain, everything? Is it all the area of Tallulah Falls?
Within the city limits, yeah.
When you say city limits, is it all of Tallulah Falls? Okay.
The only exception, I think, if you look at section 2204, bullet number 3, talks about deed restrictions. So if anybody that lives in Hickory Nut Estates and there are deed restrictions associated with that, then those deed restrictions would overrule this policy, as I understand it. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, that's what I wasn't at the last meeting, but the one before, we discussed that, and that's my understanding. And that's why I'm asking, when you say city limits, that's, to me, that's inquiring all of the area, but really, it's not, that we're going to be discussing, not Hickory Nut Mountain.
We are.
Okay, we are?
The Hickory Nut Mountain Estates is officially, is what I understand, part of the city of Tallulah
Right.
Falls. Now, the second, number 5 on our agenda is the zoning map. And the Hickory Nut Mountain Estate has not officially appeared on an official zoning map. We're going to discuss that, number 5, shortly, I hope. But the Hickory Nut Mountain Estates is within the city of Tallulah Falls. It's just not yet on the official map.
Okay, I remember the map. I remember that. So when we're talking about short-term rentals this evening, we're going to be talking about, they might be in Hickory Nut Mountain, or they will be in Hickory Nut Mountain.
they
And these are the rules that they will have to follow.
Yeah, the homeowners and property owners on Hickory Nut Mountain are going to have to abide by the ordinance that the city council eventually approved.
That's subject to bullet number 3, though, right?
And that's my question. Is
Yeah,
it?
yeah, bullet number 3
Does-
says that there are no, certified that there are no deed restrictions or covenants on the property that prohibit the use of property as a short-term rental.
And that goes back to the comment that was made that Hickory Nut Mountain at one time had restrictions and had a covenant as a homeowners association. But that has not been proven as of yet that I'm aware of. If there's a homeowners association, that would fall under that number 3.
No.
Hickory Nut Mountain has never had a homeowners association.
But there are covenants that renew every 10 years from what I'm.
Well, I'm confused too, because that's why I'm asking. That's why I'm asking about the city limits. Really, you wouldn't say city limits; you'd just say all of Tallulah Falls. And I'm confused too. I thought this, not the last one, I wasn't here, but the one before, it excluded Tallulah Falls. I'm sorry, Hickory Nut Mountain.
Well, I'm really unsure how to answer that. I'm just guessing that if the city adopts this draft ordinance, then it will supersede any covenant. Now, there may be covenants that add additional regulations, but for example, we're going to be talking about having short-term vacation rentals in R1 or residential areas. If the city eventually adopts that ordinance that prohibits short-term vacation rentals in residential areas, then the covenants cannot override that or not get super. The covenants can't allow that to happen in a residential area. No. Does that answer your question? Or is that confusing?
Not really.
I think
question-
we should.
I'm sorry.
Lost sound.
That's what I understand. Just a moment, Keith. That's what I understand. For example, the Ward, when Ward applied for a variation of the setback rules, uh, he was applying to the city of Tallulah Falls to change their setback rules. The covenants, he was within the covenant, but he had to apply the city to the city of Tallulah Falls for that variation of the setback ordinance. So I'm just assuming that any rules and regulations that apply to short-term vacation rentals will supersede any Hickory Nut Mountain covenant. Keith Nelms, you got an input? You got some input on that?
The comment I had was Keith Knudsen. I could not hear, but so I don't know what he said. My understanding, and it is some valid questions. If you look at what you have drafted, it says that if there are covenants that are more restrictive, then it sounds like you have to go with those covenants. One of the things in terms of the language that I read this afternoon said that someone has to certify that there are no covenants that impinge on doing a short-term rental. And so if there are covenants on Hickory Nut Mountain, and we were doing things in a residential area, the language that I read this afternoon sounds like those covenants would take precedent and would prevent short-term rentals from happening. That may
I agree.
that may be why we need a lawyer to sit down and help lay all this out.
So the question is, where are the covenants?
I think that is the question. I think we need to understand what the Hickory Nut subdivision covenants and deed restrictions are
Yes.
and where are they documented. And we need to review those because the way the language is today, the Hickory Nut Mountain covenants would supersede this document based on section 2204, bullet number 3.
My question is if there's not a homeowners association, who enforces the covenant?
Well, usually it's the people that ownership
The
of the,
owners.
of the community. I mean, of the community. And there's a committee and then they enforce it. And then, you know, they get little tickets. And then when they start to move, if everything's not okay, they can be penalized. I mean, that's my understanding in a nutshell.
Well, my opinion on that is that if eventually say there is a homeowner and they do write or update the covenant, and those covenants allow for short-term vacation rentals in that Hickory Nut Mountain state, I don't think that they would be able to do that. No, I don't.
Well, she just said, I just made a general statement. That's my understanding of when you have a homeowners association. I didn't mean to imply that there was one. I was just what I've experienced with homeowners association. That it's the people involved that live there that enforce it.
And tell me again where you're reading that. I'm just not seeing it right off the bat.
I'm looking at the appendix A
Okay.
on zoning, and I'm looking at section 2204,
Okay. Okay.
and it's bullet number 3. It says that applicant, talking about applications, it says certify that there are no deed restrictions and/or covenants on a property that prohibit the use of the property as an STVR. So my only point was that Hickory Nut Mountain Estates does have deed restrictions or covenants that are on file. Those would override this particular article that we're talking about tonight.
I think I understand. So what you're saying that if the city council were to approve an ordinance that allows short-term vacation rentals in R1, would the Hickory Nut Mountain Covenant veto that?
Yes, the
Yeah.
way I,
Yeah.
They didn't like it.
sorry about that.
Mm.
But yeah, the way I understand it is, if this particular, short-term vacation rental regulation is adopted, that it still cannot override deeds and covenant restrictions from a subdivision.
To be clear about this, wouldn't it be simpler if we could come under town of Tallulah Falls regulations that would cover all of it? Is that what we're trying to do?
It would definitely be simple. At this point, I have not seen any deed restrictions or covenants associated with Hickory Nut Mountain Estate, so
Uh-huh.
I don't really know.
Yeah.
We would have to look at those documents if they even exist. But if they don't exist, then obviously that's exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
The entire town would be under the same regulations.
I'm trying to define this because I'm against short-term rentals in residential areas. And in this area, in the business area, short-term rentals, I wouldn't have a
Before
problem.
you commit to that, I guess we ought to have the public hearing first.
Well,
Make our
I'm trying to
comments on
answer
that.
this question. That's why I wouldn't say all of it, because I know I'm against short-term rentals in a residential area, in R1.
Perhaps we should hear the public comment, public input first
Okay,
before we make a decision about whether we do or do not want to adopt this ordinance.
okay.
But to answer your question, Stan, I don't think personally that the covenants could supersede city ordinance if we're part of the city. That's just my opinion.
That's not. Where did you get this? Where did this come
Draft of what we're going to propose
from? Oh, okay. Oh, from the last meeting? Oh,
from the last few minutes.
okay, all right, thank you. Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, before we move on to the public hearing part, I'm going to just make a comment about how we got here. Spring of last year, discussions began in the city council regarding short-term vacation rentals and the need for additional rules and regulations regarding those short-term vacation rentals. And in July, the city council asked for advice from the city attorney about placing a moratorium on short-term vacation rentals in the R1 district. And the Planning and Zoning Commission was created largely to deal or that an ordinance or that additional rules and regulations to govern short-term vacation rentals. In August, the city council approved of a 180-day moratorium against new applications for short-term vacation rentals. And the Planning and Zoning Commission began to meet and what was sort of side railed by our motion to change zoning in a particular area, and that consumed our time and consumed our meetings for a couple of months. And then it was January that we began again to discuss short-term vacation rentals, and we had a meeting and had public input, and it was at that meeting we had in January that the Planning and Zoning Commission, after hearing public input and discussion, took a vote, and we voted to allow short-term vacation rentals in all districts, with the exception of R1 flood hazard sensitive land. So we sort of dealt with that issue in January. But we had no public hearings. That was just a public input. In March, we also passed out samples of short-term vacation rental ordinances from other counties and cities to look at and make suggestions. In March, we came up with this draft ordinance that we all reviewed and agreed to. But it was that point that we stopped having meetings due to the pandemic shutdown. And so we never had a chance to have a public meeting on the draft ordinance until today. So the draft ordinance has been published, and everyone has had a chance to look at it. And today we're going to have a public input on this draft ordinance. And then after the public comment section is over, then we're going to entertain, I hope, a motion to forward this ordinance to the city council for their workshop tomorrow in reviewing. The current ordinance expires in early August, and there's only a short amount of time left for the moratorium expires for the city council to conduct their own hearing and make a decision about additional rules and regulations. So at this point, I am going to ask if there's anyone out in the bay that wants to come in and speak for, is it for, speak for the ordinance? Right, Linda's bringing somebody. Good afternoon. Well, we have some, don't mind, before you want to state your name and
Christy Shepherd, and I live on Hickory Nut Mountain Road. I came to speak in behalf or in favor of the ordinance. If you've driven up Hickory Nut Mountain Road, you know that we do not have a legal size road. It covers about 1.5 cars, and any additional traffic would be a problem for residents. Trying to put people that don't know to scoot over, give somebody else the right of way, it's going to be a problem. We see it all the time coming up and down the mountain with workers, building houses or having any kind of work done. It's a nuisance already. We make it work, but I think the additional traffic would definitely create a hardship for the families that live there. And I actually do have a copy of the covenants for Hickory Nut Mountain Road, and they state that there can be no commercial activities conducted in Hickory Nut Mountain Road. So if you consider a short-term vacation rental a commercial activity, then it's prohibited. And those were filed in 1985 with the Raven County Courthouse. You can find those there.
thank you, Christy.
Thank you.
And Wi-Fi. I don't know if anybody else works from home that lives up there, but we don't get adequate internet service, and having additional people on and pulling it in vacation homes that people aren't really using anyway would create more of a problem too. I know my house has been a problem trying to homeschool and work from home at the same time on 15 megabytes when we're not really even getting 15. So having all those additional people is going to create a problem. I don't think that not think about, unless you do work from home too. So.
I assure you that you're not the only one to have that problem. In fact, I think our mayor is working on that particular problem as we speak.
Well, I would love it. Thank you.
All right, anything
Thank
else?
you.
All right, is there anyone else out in the bay that would like to come in and speak? On behalf of the ordinance. Okay. I'll ask Mr. Nelms. Go ahead, Keith.
Okay, Keith Nelms, Hickory Nut Mountain. I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on Zoom, but it would be very helpful when we talk about the covenant and town regulation and who's on top and who's on bottom to actually get the town attorney to walk us through that to make sure we understand the precedents. I am definitely in favor of the ordinance to ban short-term rentals in all residential properties. I sent to Van this afternoon just some section by section. There are a couple of things that suggestions for you guys to look at. My biggest concern is section 2206. There is no standard or requirements for behavior of people renting in short-term facilities as appears to be that would be the appropriate place for it. And so, I think that needs to be looked at. That's the section that I believe talks about what can lead to having your STR revoked. And there's several things there, but nothing about the behavior of your renters. So maybe that needs to be addressed there. And section 2207, needs to have clearly stated who you're going to call if there are problems, with short-term renters. Probably the police department, but maybe it's stated there. There's a handful of other smaller things that just take a look at with the language. Christie's right. The covenants for Hickory Nut Mountain state in section 9, there will be no commercial activities conducted upon any of said property, and then it goes on, but it says no commercial activity. Both the draft that the Planning and Zoning Board have provided and the draft that the Irvins have provided, part of that says there will be a business license. You have to have a business license. If you have to have business license, that by definition is commercial activity. And that by definition should not be in residential, but be in a business district. Zoning is about 100 years old. It's developed over the years, and it was developed to protect residential investment and residential living from business and other incursions. And it's there to protect business from residential incursions. So it has a history. And even though technology has led us to disrupting a few industries like the taxi industry and the hotel industry, just because there's some disruptions doesn't mean that's what we should do. So I would strongly suggest we make it townwide for short-term rentals. Again, covenants for Hickory Nut Mountain properties, though those have been there for years. So anyone who's purchased those properties should know that no commercial activity is expected to take place. For people who want to do short-term rentals, DDA chair in favor. We need the income to the town, but it needs to be in business or in an appropriate district. I know the folks that are interested in doing short-term rentals have plenty of business property in the town that would be well suited for short-term rental, and that could be done. If there's ever a need to put short-term rental in a residential area, that's what planning and zoning is for. Someone could come and ask for the area to be rezoned. So I think it's kind of pretty simple. Business does not belong in the residential area. So sort of my comment.
Had a homeowners association.
Right, and it's clear there's never been
Never been,
a homeowners association in Hickory Nut Mountain.
ever.
All right, is there anyone else that wants to speak on behalf of the ordinance or approve or approve of the ordinance? Anyone else? Not sure who this gentleman is at the bottom. All right. So that will be it for the people who are in favor of the draft ordinance. Is there anyone in the Bay that would like to speak against the ordinance?
Irvin's gonna come in, but he wants.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Irvin.
Hey,
If you would state your name.
Dave Irvin.
All right. Go ahead.
Our attorney should be online.
Mr. Chairman.
Is that Sean Evans?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
All right, why don't you go first, Mr. Irvin?
Well, I just, we just want to be able to use our property. Develop our property, and we plan on being good neighbors. We have a good track record, and we've done this elsewhere. We've had no issues because we police are, we're a contributor to the community over there. Police our own property as well as if we need. We plan on being non-intrusive. That's all I got to say.
So you are against the way the ordinance is written
Yes.
regarding
Yes.
restrictions in R1, is that correct? Mr. Abrams, you have anything you want to add?
It's Sean Adams at 1960 Satellite Boulevard in Duluth. Thank you for having me here virtually. I am here on behalf of the Irvin family and want to speak with some of the concerns regarding the ordinance. I believe you guys should also have a draft of some of our proposed red lines that either Mr. Tillery, I think Mr. Chairman, you received that as well from me yesterday. And based on some of the comments I heard already, what I'd like to go ahead and start out by articulating is that the short-term rental, vacation rental that I'm thinking of right now, especially with regard to R1, we're talking still about a single-family home style, a detached home, 2-3 bedroom, whatever the case may be, that would conform to your development regs for R1. We're not talking about a multi-family or condo or micro boutique hotel type of concept that some may be thinking of. And so when I hear about traffic concerns, if you already have an undeveloped lot on Hickory Nut Mountain, if somebody were to build a 2-bedroom cabin on there right now and live in it full time, that would generate the same traffic as a family renting it out for a 3 or 4 day weekend while they're there. And so that's kind of the context. I'm looking at an R1. The way I review the ordinance as proposed in conjunction with your existing ordinance is the short-term vacation rental ordinance as proposed here provides a framework by which you can track those properties that are operating a short-term rental and allow for the opportunity to make sure that they have the necessary fire safety code. They're following code that way with the IFC. And I know in a lot of jurisdictions, they've made it to where they want to collect the hotel motel tax. And I think that is something that, we are amenable to here as well. So to the point about requiring a business license, it's not that renting a property for less than 30 days necessarily requires a business license. The business license or business occupation tax certificate is actually a conduit by which local jurisdictions are able to identify the properties and register them to be able to collect hotel motel tax. But really the difference between a family renting a property on Hickory Nut Mountain with you, if you will, or another single family residence, really the difference between someone just leasing it with a long-term lease or a short-term vacation rental is the days. It's whether it's under 30 days, it qualifies as a short-term vacation rental. If it's 31 days or 60 days, it becomes a regular lease. But it's still family that's occupying the property based on whatever the occupancy standards are for the period of time while they're renting from the actual property owner. And so with that in mind, the concern regarding the R1 zoning district and prohibiting it is that in Tallulah Falls, that is your only single-family residential district that you have. And, outside of keeping rooms, hotels, condos, things like that, your short-term vacation rentals tend to be cabins or single family homes, whether they're small or standard size. And where those are typically constructed are in residential zoning districts based on residential development regs. So by prohibiting the use of short-term vacation rentals in R1, one of two things essentially is going to happen. A property owner who wishes to operate a short-term vacation rental in an R1 zoning is either going to have to come and request a zoning to either the R2, which is really a multifamily zoning, or a commercial zoning. And what happens if they go to that rezoning is you're going to have to make one of two decisions. There's either an unintended consequence of bringing a commercial or multifamily zoning to a residential area, or if you allow it, that's what will happen there. Otherwise, you would deny the application and say that it would not be in conformance with the land use plan because you would be putting commercial zoning or multifamily zoning residential area. And what that leaves the property owner with is no opportunity for use of the property as a short-term vacation rental within the town. I mean, I hear the calls for having them in the downtown area in a commercial area, but a typical single-family home or cabin wouldn't necessarily fit with that. It may be opportunity for a small-scale micro boutique hotel type of concept or small-scale condo type of concept downtown where you have a little more density, but a typical cabin or single family home, usually if it's not built into the antebellum style that we've had when towns really created and already there, bringing it in anew is not something that you typically see. And so that's one of the reasons why we have concerns. Also doing that would be a massive departure from what a lot of your short-term rental ordinances around the state, including North Georgia, have already done. I know I have copies of 3 of the ordinances that y'all looked at in consideration of yours. City of Clayton, for instance, does not have a restriction within a residential zoning class. Neither does Tybee Island. I know that's down on the coast, but that was in here. And even White County, even though they have some restrictions, White County has multiple residential zoning classifications by which it is allowed. And so there's still the opportunity in residential setting under certain parameters to allow for it. With that in mind, what we would say is that we do not, we actually understand and do not object to the intent of the ordinance with regard to licensing, tax collection, and operation of the short-term vacation rentals. And with the concerns of mine and knowing that, what I'd like to do is kind of quickly jot through what our proposed changes are. Hopefully you have them before you. But under section 2203, we do propose striking the R1 so that they can be permitted subject to compliance with the remaining applicable provisions in the code. And what that also means too, something that, because I heard about a comment was made about how to police it or the actions of those who are on the property. You have those protections in place now under chapter 24 in your nuisance ordinance. You have protections for 24.5 for disturbing the peace, 24.9 for noise, and there are various other protections in your nuisance ordinance as well. All of those provisions of your overarching ordinance would apply to guests of a short-term vacation rental, just like they would to a primary resident or they would to a long-term renter of the property. So you do have those protections in place now. Nothing would change that. Same with the development regs, fire protection, those items that you already have in your ordinance with regarding to developing a property to build a cabin on it. It would be subject to those same protections that you already have in your ordinance, in addition to any other requirements you have in this ordinance, such as fire alarms and smoke detectors in each of the rooms, things of that nature. So you do have those protections in place for the city. In addition to striking the R1 and 2203, if you go down to section 2204, we propose striking item 1, and that's really only because that's the only area where conditional use permits are referenced in this proposed ordinance. So I believe it might be an unintended carryover of a prior draft. However, though, the chapter 18, sections 83 through 93 that deal with the room tax, we have no problem complying with that. We believe that is perfectly fine and understand the intent. So there are no issues there with complying with that section of the code. Under 2205E, it deals with occupancy. And what I did there is I essentially swapped the bedroom occupancy standard with state of Georgia fire and safety codes. And the reason why is because I could not find where the bedroom occupancy standard is defined within the town of Tallulah Falls zoning ordinance or in their ordinance at all. However, you do reference under Chapter 14, Section 46, fire protection in the International Fire Code. And I know that is something that state of Georgia also references as the IFC and the IBC. And so I just swapped it out there because the state of Georgia Fire and Safety Code not only will address the occupancy, but it is also what governs your certificate of occupancy, which determines how many people can occupy the property at a given time. There are a couple of minor adjustments that I made that are not substantive or I propose, such as Section 2206A. I referenced levy of a judgment versus legal process. But the final substantive change that we propose is your current Section 2209, I moved that down to Section 2210. And Section 2209 on our red line now includes a license reinstatement process. And all that does is basically say that if someone were to receive a violation or penalty and fine upon the payment of the fine or penalty or proof of the cure of the violation or any kind of probationary period that may be put down or forced down on the or judged by the municipal court, that there's the opportunity either to apply for a reinstatement of the license or reapply for the license altogether, depending whether we were dealing with a suspension or revocation. Those are the primary changes that we have at this time. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have regarding our changes or concerns.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Abrams. I guess I should have asked if we had any questions for any of the people who participated, including Christie. She was the first one, because I guess she's still out there. Does anybody have any questions for Christie Shepherd in favor of the ordinance? Tressa, Stan,
I actually do have a couple of questions.
Christie,
Yes.
or Mr. Christie still out there? Hang around, Mr. Irvin. We'll have a question for you, Ron. Yeah, I guess I should ask when you were standing up here before, but there, we do have a question or two for you, your comments. Go ahead, Stan.
Sure, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you talked about the width of the roadway not being to county standards and so forth. Have you personally, or have you heard of anyone that has experienced a safety issue while traveling down the road?
Yes, I had to drive my husband's truck last week, and it's big, and I've been terrified that I'm going to meet somebody on the side of the road. I think I've met you several times on the side of the road, and I mean, it becomes a point where you just pray you don't meet anybody from the rock to the first driveway, because there's nowhere to go unless you, in that one little area, there's like a turnoff, but there's nowhere to go. It's you, somebody's either going to hit the side of the mountain or somebody's going to go in the lake. There's not even a guardrail up to protect anybody from falling off. We have visitors that walk the road all the time. You're going to have that with people that are coming in to visit that want to see the beauty of our area. I mean, it's gorgeous. We live in a great spot, but there's so many more safety concerns with things not being up to standard to put short-term vacation rentals in that area. People not knowing where they're going in the dark. I've had people that have come out the inn and I've had to stop and not get hit. Twice that's happened to people with Florida tags. I don't know if they own a house up here, but I would think that they would understand. You go to the right, but that have come out the inside of the divided area right there. So it's a big safety concern, especially with people that aren't familiar with our area and don't have those stop, pull over, let somebody else go. If they think they don't understand that, you know, it's not as wide as you think it is. And you start getting things that are going to be up there on that tiny road. We can't tell you what kind of services you can have. Once you agree to this, you can't say, well, you're not allowed to have, you know, XYZ come up through here because the trucks won't fit. Okay, so if we get a big truck making delivery like that, who's going to win that battle? Who's going to win the battle? Where are you going to go? If it's an oversized truck, where's it going to go? This weekend I had a delivery from some patio furniture, and I actually had to meet the guy down the mountain in front of the post office because it wasn't fair to him to bring a 26-foot box truck up our road, and it wasn't fair to my neighbors to have that happen and have to play chicken with that man. it would just been a nightmare for everybody all around. So our road is not safe for 2 cars to be on it at one time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question for Christine? Mr. Nelms, you spoke in favor of the, I'll ask if any of the planning and zoning board members have questions for Mr. Nelms.
And Mrs. Nelms is right behind me.
All right, Keith, you were talking about, there should be, something about the behavior of residents in that, should people's behavior, be different for short-term vacation rentals than, say, for permanent residents?
Well,
Bad behavior apply to everyone, within the city?
I think generally so. And let me say thank you to, I believe it's Mr. Adams. I have not had a lot of time to look at his draft, but some of the things in the language he promotes further down the line addresses some of the questions that I had highlighted about standards for and criteria. So I hope the town council will take a look at, that entire document, and in places where he strengthens what you've said, please make use of it. And his reference to, all of the standards for nuisance, et cetera, elsewhere in the charter would apply to this. I have not tracked those down, so it may well be that those standards for nuisance behavior and that sort of thing may take care of my concerns with the behavior of renters in an STR. I do know that we have had problems with people visiting in some of the cabins up here with behavior. And so, we need to make sure that's reinforced. The standards elsewhere in the charter may be adequate. I have to sit down and look at those in detail. Does that get at your question, Fan?
Does, Tracy have any,
I don't think so. I actually, I'd like to address the situation with the road on Hickory Nut Mountain. Now,
hold on for that.
all right, go ahead.
And then, and we're gonna close some public comment, and then we're all gonna talk about it.
All right.
So save that question. Any of the board members have any questions for Mr. Urban? Gailey? All right, does anyone have any questions for Mr. Abrams? Is it right? Adams, I apologize. Does any board members have any questions?
I can only say that's a lot to absorb. And he talked really fast. I really couldn't follow what you were saying because I was trying to flip through and follow, and I couldn't. So I would say I would want to entertain myself to this more and to what he said and what it really means. And really, and you need an attorney for that. To look at this to see if what he's saying and this is saying it coincide. I'm not an attorney, but I really didn't understand everything he was saying. Did anybody else have that problem?
Well, I did it. As a matter of fact, I had to understand some of what he said.
Well, that's me, not every word of it. I'm just saying overall, generally, some of it, because he was talking really fast and I was trying to follow it, and I don't have a background in this, so I'm trying to learn, and it was just difficult.
Mr. Adams, do you have a reply to that?
What I would say is I'm happy to touch on any one item. I mean, I know I spoke a lot on the front end regarding our concerns with, as it relates to the R1 piece being prohibited, just because the nature of your ordinance now does not have other residential zoning classifications like other jurisdictions might. The only ones that I've seen other than ag would be the R2, which is actually more meant for multifamily or townhome. And what we're really looking at here is your typical single family home or cabin style as it relates to this ordinance. I mean, I think something that's a higher density that might fit in the DDA area or downtown, that would be governed. I think that would fall into this ordinance just fine. and would be governed by those other zoning districts as well. So, the substantive changes that I've proposed really, there's only 2 or 3, and it would be deleting the R1 as a prohibition, and then also at the bottom, adding the reinstatement option for the license if it's been revoked by some way, as long as they have shown that they've cured the violation and they've paid any fines or done any prohibition time that may have been ordered by the judge. But scanning back through it again, the only other one was the occupancy. And again, what I referenced there was I think you pulled bedroom occupancy standard from another ordinance potentially, because I've seen that, I think, in the city of Clayton. But since it's not defined in the town ordinance as of right now that I've seen, I was using the state of Georgia Fire and Safety Code, which has your typical occupancy standards for all types of housing, single family on up. And it's actually typically the standard that your fire chief would rely on when inspecting properties and issuing certificates of occupancy and putting whatever that stated occupancy max is, whether it's commercial or residential. And so that's a generally accepted principle for occupancy. So I proposed that switch just because it lines up with your ordinance as your ordinance already is drafted overall. So those are the big 3 changes that I have. If there's anything specific that you have a question on, I'm happy to answer or kind of reiterate with that in mind.
Well, about the bedroom occupancy standard, yeah, that was plagiarized from another ordinance. But what I understand is that's a housing and urban development recommendation as far as 2 persons per bedroom. And this proposed ordinance is saying 2 persons per bedroom plus 2 more. So if there's a mother and a child and a mother and a father and a child, or 2 children, they could stay in the same room without violating this ordinance. So it's a housing and urban development recommendation.
And that may be very well the case in my reading of it in terms of bedroom or sleeping quarters, because I know under development regulations, bedrooms have very specific meanings, right? They have to have certain things to be a bedroom, a functioning window or door, access to the outside, that sort of thing. Whereas sleeping quarters could have a broader meaning. But since I didn't see it defined in the ordinance already, I proposed that change. So I guess what my reading of the 2 per bedroom or sleeping quarters plus 2 would probably conform to most of what I've seen in short-term cabins, because most of them, they have 2 bedrooms and they have maybe a basement with a sleeper sofa or a living room with a sleeper sofa that you commonly see in a lot of these cabins or single family homes. And in that scenario, that falls under a bedroom or sleeping quarters. And then you add 2 as well. That typically would comply. But since I didn't see a definition, I made that proposal. So I guess my kind of counter or alternative solution would be either taking the HUD definition and incorporating it into the ordinance so that it's clear what the occupancy standard is for the Township of the Falls, or since the fire and safety code tends to typically mirror that standard anyway, even if it's written differently, since you already referenced the fire and safety code in your ordinance, I just kind of made that suggested switch.
I understand. I do have another question. You, in section 2204, you struck through number 1 that refers back to chapter 18, which is basically the application process and the fees and taxes that go along with that. Why do you object to that particular number 1, 2204, number 1?
So the reason why I struck through it actually is not related to the room tax piece. It's related to the conditional use permit part, because I think that was a carryover from a prior draft. You don't reference conditional use permits anywhere else in the ordinance. And so I struck that, but we are actually fine with the provisions of chapter 18 and those sections 83 to 93 to deal with the room tax. We think that makes sense. That's okay to be able to pay the hotel motel tax. So perhaps an alternative to that would be just since it's under the applicant section, you'd strike the STVR conditional use permit part and just say applicant must comply with. that might be a way to do that so that you maintain the compliance with the room tax piece.
Okay.
I have a question.
Go
Mayor.
ahead.
How do you control, how would you control the occupancy? There's supposed to be 4, and but they decide to bring Aunt Susie and the grandkids. Who's going to know that? And they're next door to me, and who do I call? So and I think we've all done that, and you have teenagers, we've all been teenagers, we know how that is.
So what I have found in a lot of cases with short-term rentals, I know some people who have houses that aren't even necessarily in a hot short-term rental area, if you will, but have been able to rent their property out enough to make sense, and they have found they can keep better care of the property and have more control over the tenants because the turnover is shorter. Whereas if you have a long-term tenant that comes in and 6 months in, they're not caring for the property, they're having friends over, you have less control, and the process to evict them is longer. You have to go through an entire eviction process because they have rights under a long-term lease. Whereas a short-term vacation rental occupant, they have that contract for that period of time. And typically what these contracts have in them is they'll have provisions in there if you exceed occupancy that you can be removed from the property prior to the end of your stay. You'd have to pay additional fines. There's a lot there that they have. I've seen some management companies that do a lot of vacation rentals in other areas in North Georgia that will actually have cameras on the outside of the house that point to you can't do it on the inside because it's a violation of privacy issue, but they'll have it pointed to the driveway and they'll track who comes in as an overnight guest. But beyond that, it's the same way that you would have controls in place for a permanent resident or someone who, keep in mind that I heard somebody say Florida tags, and I know they love to come to the North Georgia mountains. And, there's a lot of Florida people that may have a home in North Georgia and come up 6 months out of the year. They may own the property, but they're only here on a short term, and this doesn't address them at all. You have those other controls in terms of no off-street parking and all the nuisance controls that you have in your ordinance. So yes, a neighbor could complain and say, hey, look, they've overflowed the trash can, or they're outside, they violated the noise ordinance, they're disturbing the peace, and code enforcement or your police power can enforce that, and they would notify. And I think in your ordinance, as you have it here, you propose a contact that's available 24 hours a day that's within close proximity to the property. So you don't have to worry about some long range investor coming in and buying and living out of state or something else. They would be local and have a local contact who can respond to such issues right away, which is another protection that you have in place for the town that you wouldn't have in place if it was somebody who used to live here and had to move away and they're renting out their house now long term. They could be, in two states away and have a long-term tenant that may not comply. But so you have your code enforcement provisions in place now that would help enforce that, plus additional protections by the owner. Because if the property has issues or concerns, then obviously the owner is not able to release it to somebody else for a short time, and it impacts them as well. And so they actually keep a closer guard on a short-term rental than you typically see with long-term.
Well, the question still is, you said a lot, but the question still is, a car comes up and it's supposed to be 4. They bring Aunt Susan and the grandkids and the teenagers. How do you deal with that until after what you're saying, if I understand? Until this happens, after the fact, and they're my neighbors, and I have to call somebody, they're to come out. How do you deal with that? And you,
Answer that.
oh, okay.
Answer that. Okay. First of all, we have in our policies, when we do short-term rentals, we have a good track record, check on us. We've been in business, I don't know how many years, 20 years, and we don't have complaints at our places. Because we have in our policies, they have to be a certain age to even rent them. We have in our policies, they cannot exceed certain occupancy limits. We have that in our policies. And if we find out they do, and I have before, it's very seldom, we go in and we tell them to leave. We'll tell them all to leave, everybody. Now, that night. So if I get a call and someone's violating that, I will come out, or I'll send an agent out. And if I can't get a hold of an agent, I'll send the police out. But usually it's me or one of my agents will evict them. Now, if I have a long-term renter in there, I can't do it. I cannot do it.
That's true.
Y'all
I
have-
do agree
you
with
have,
that.
under this, which we're agreeing with, you have more control over us than you do a normal property owner or renter. As far as traffic, it's irrelevant. If I build houses there or rental homes there, you're gonna have the same amount of traffic. So the arguments and the concerns and the fears that you have, I plan on taking care of. So you'll have not only you have your police to take care of it, you have us as additional level of that. If I don't, I'm fine.
So it's
So you
your,
have a whole lot more control over what we do than you do normal property owners or normal renters. And
I've had
we're
renters.
agreement, we're in agreement with that. We're in agreement with it. I'm wanting to be a good neighbor. I've already said we're planning on building we're planning on building as little of intrusion, interference with other property owners as possible.
So is your plan, I know the Irvins own a lot of property on Hickory Nut Mountain and in Duluth also. So
Well-
is your plan is to build,
Johnny does. This is me and Johnny that owns this,
okay,
that we're talking about.
okay. So your plan is to build, in the properties that he owns, including,
That we own, that we,
yeah, that you own, to build houses, but not have them for two-family, not for single-family dwellings, but have them for rental houses.
well, we may do both.
We haven't talked about that. We
Yeah.
talked about rent,
We-
so,
We
so
may
that's.
sell- We
oh, I'm
may
sorry.
sell them.
So
We
you're,
may sell them. My plan right now is to do short-term rentals. In reality, that's the best thing for the whole community. That's my opinion, and really it bears out in fact in what our history has been.
would you want those rentals at your house?
Yeah, I wouldn't have any problem with it at all. No, I'd rather have a short-term renter than some long-term renters or some neighbors. Especially if you got the town that helps you control it. The town, there's guidelines in there the town controls. And we control in our own policies. I think y'all are afraid of you're either afraid of what may happen or you don't want development, period. It's
No,
gonna be-
I'm
we're gonna
not
build,
that,
we're
but-
going to build. And we plan on building short-term rentals. In my opinion, short-term rentals are a whole lot better than the alternative.
Wouldn't you agree that rental property devalues the existing
No.
property? Well, you
No.
wouldn't agree with
No,
that?
no. If you go to any tourist area, short vacation homes, which is, by the way, in your deed restrictions, it says vacation homes. And probably, I don't know how many people up there have vacation homes. A lot of vacation home people up there. There's probably, as a matter of fact, the mayor has said in the past, there's a lot of people under radar renting. Yeah, well, I'm here to help control that problem. I'm not here to add to it.
So you wouldn't
have
agree?
you have campers everywhere. I've been around, I've seen it. Y'all can't police it all.
You wouldn't agree that rental properties devalue?
No.
Really?
I own some properties that are in other areas in Pigeon Forge and in Jekyll Island, and the property values go up. You sell a vacation home and everything to somebody, they're willing to pay a lot of money for it.
I'm not, I'm not against the government and I'm not for growth. I mean, I am. But rental property, I've had rental property.
Have you had long-term and short-term?
No, I had long-term.
Okay, yeah, long-term's the problem. I'd really rather not do that. I'd rather not do that.
So I have a question for Mr. Adams. As Van already mentioned, you struck through section 2204, bullet number 1, and you inserted some comments down at the bottom of the page. And I just want to read this so that everybody else that's listening can hear what you wrote. And it says, as an alternative to permitting STVRs in R1, another solution would be to expressly exempt those parcels with invested rights for development as STVR, including the 24 parcels currently owned by the Urbans. Should this alternative be considered, parcel IDs will be provided for inclusion in this ordinance. So Mr. Adams, my direct question, and to Mr. Irvin as well, if he wishes to comment, do you honestly expect this commission to adopt a policy that specifically provides benefits to one landowner?
Actually, sir, what I would say is that it's not specific to one landowner. And this is actually a footnote to section 2203. So and basically what I looked at is that there was, I mean, our opinion is that prohibiting an R1 has broad issues just because it's your primary residential zoning district. You don't have other options like other jurisdictions might have. What we're saying is anytime you start to get in that line, what you could look at is kind of like a look forward, essentially. So what that alternative is saying is you could expressly exempt parcels that have vested rights in R1. And what that means is they have currently any R1 property that currently has single family home on it that has an intent or has taken steps in reasonable reliance on the ordinance as it was when the time they bought it to be able to utilize it as a short-term vacation rental. So what I'm saying is, you know, you could take, and there's a couple different ways that could be looked at. I think it is more complex. I think the preference would be as we put it in there. But vested rights becomes an issue that you start to get into in terms of unreasonable restrictions on someone's right to use and enjoy their property and things of that nature. And so in an effort to avoid that, if it was the will of the town to say, well, we really just don't want them in R1, then one of the ways to help with that is to say, okay, basically, if you're already in an R1 property and you bought the property or have expended resources on the property with the intent to use it and reliance of how the ordinance was when you bought it, then you can proceed to do it that way. But any future zoned R1 property or what have you that was done after the adoption of the ordinance would not have that exemption. So it is not the intent to say it's just the urban property. It would be any R1 property with vested rights prior to the adoption of this ordinance. We're just saying that includes, they roughly have 24 parcels that we are asserting they have vested rights in already. And so some cases you might see it where they do that exemption and they list the parcel IDs as a part of the ordinance that they are exempting or grandfathering in, if you will. Other ways you might say any property newly zoned R1 after the date of the ordinance. There's a couple different ways to do that. Obviously, your attorney would articulate that. I do think that is more of a fallback that we wanted to put out there as an alternative, but do believe firmly that our preference and best course would be the removal of R1 as a prohibition.
So just to recap, what you're suggesting is that anyone that owns R1 property today should be grandfathered to do whatever they want to do with that property, and it only applies to people going forward. Is that what you basically said?
When you say do whatever they want with it, with regard to the
Guidelines, yeah.
with regard to the ordinance as it was drafted, they would still, you know, our intent here was that the additional regulation in terms of licensing and paying taxes, they would still comply that way, but the use prohibition, prohibiting the use, because when people buy a property, they run their due diligence at the point when they purchase it with what those possible uses are, and you're taking away one of those uses that would have been available to them at the time they purchased the property. And so that creates a vested right in them. And so we're saying from a look forward approach would be another alternative.
Okay, thank you.
Does any other board members have any questions for Mr. Adams or Mr. Irwin?
I'd like to bring something up about, should we get a surge in vacation rentals and building? Do we have the infrastructure to handle that type of thing? And I think that should be a concern. Increased traffic. Christie brought up a good point about traffic on narrow roads. I don't think it's a real big problem. I've never had an issue. I've been here for 19 years, and I can never remember an accident on Hickory Nut Mountain Road. But I worry more about the infrastructure. Roads, water, sewer. So I think that should be an issue and a concern.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Newsom. Mr. Adams, I do have one other question about the amendment. In section 2206, section A, you struck through the part that talks about suspending a license for any owner of a short-term vacation rental who is filing bankruptcy, receivership, or levy of legal process. You struck through the legal process and put judgment in there. My question is, there are provisions in this draft ordinance for a person whose license has been revoked for some reason to go before the city council to try to resolve that revocation. And then if they're not happy with that, they can go to the municipal court and then ultimately to the Superior Court of Raven County. Why do you think we should wait for a judgment before we revoke someone's license?
So the reason why we did that there is because a levy of legal process in general legal process would be an overly broad term. So if you're levying something, you would be levying a decision or an order, or to the point of a bankruptcy or receivership. In those cases, you're acting on it there. And so if you're talking outside of a bankruptcy or a receivership, the judgment is going to determine if there's a levy of anything. Just saying a levy of legal process, we felt it was overly broad, that you might argue that someone could bring suit, and it doesn't require for anybody, in order for someone to bring suit, they don't have to have an actual claim initially to bring the suit. And so you could argue that if someone wanted to sue just for the sake of suing it to get us, in this situation under A, it's immediate. So there's no due process under A. So the due process you're talking about is under the B and C section. So what we're saying here is that there's a levy of a judgment upon the owner, then we understand, just like with a bankruptcy or receivership. So we felt that just made it more clear that it was a claim that had merit, that gets an immediate revocation. Anything else short of that, if it's a violation or complaint or something like that, to me, that's what would be triggered under the ones that you made in terms of B and C.
But obtaining a judgment or a settlement could take quite a while, could it?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I think it's still overly broad in general. If you're talking, it depends on what you're talking about. I mean, I read the intent of A to be, if you're talking about, the bankruptcy or receivership, I mean, that happens someone goes into bankruptcy, they're not able to hold the property. And so you're pulling it and goes in receivership. Essentially somebody else is holding it at that time. Levy of a judgment could be relatively quick. It depends on what it is. But saying a levy of legal process, in my view of it, is if somebody had an issue with the property, maybe they were trying to find a way to get short-term vacation rental out of there, they could file the suit for anything frivolous, really, and that would immediately revoke it under a levy of legal process. Because just filing the suit doesn't require you to actually have facts to support your claim. You have to go through the process of discovery and everything else and getting to a point of stating your claim, filing motions and things of that nature to get to the point of judgment. But you also have other protections in place with immediate suspension if it's something that deals with creates an unsafe condition, things of that nature. You're still protected as a town to suspend it until such time that it's fully resolved, and that's where your council or your municipal judge would be able to adjudicate it that way. So, I mean, I feel like you still have those protections in place where it's not ongoing, but this was the immediate, without due process revocation of the license, and where we felt like if you're going to go that route, in order to be consistent with the bankruptcy or receivership, you would want to levy a judgment because levy a legal process is just overly broad. We're certainly happy to talk with your town attorney and see what the intent was there, and if there's somewhere in between, to have that dialogue. But I was only going with what I was able to read within section 2206.
Okay, thank you, I understand. All right, before we close the public input part, the public hearing part, are there any other questions from the board members or any rebuttal that they'd like to bring up before we close the public hearing part of this? Tressa, Dan, Keith? Okay, then at this point, then I'm going to close the public hearing part of this meeting, and then we board members are going to discuss what we want to do regarding this proposed or this draft of this ordinance. Chris, I'll start with you. You're on my left, I'm afraid. You want to make any comments about the ordinance that we're proposing to send to the city council?
Nothing other than the fact that the changes that he made, the red line changes that he
Mhm.
made, I agree with those because it does clarify a lot of the issues that we had, and it makes for more understanding overall.
Okay. All the changes?
All of the changes.
Including,
With the exception of the completely striking R1,
Mhm.
because I still have questions with that, and that's something that I really would like to go further. And I know we've got time limits, but that's the one thing that I would like to go into further. Just because of the R1, I'm not completely omitting it, but clarifying some of the issues with like the covenants and things. Covenants superseded where his areas are, then it wouldn't matter for his purposes anyway. So, and I guess I'm speaking from someone who lives in an R1, that I wouldn't necessarily have neighbors that rents out their property. But that's my private opinion. Publicly, I mean, you need to have that clarified a little bit. I know we've talked about it a lot, but it still needs to be clarified as far as the covenant nature. There'll still be some question about that.
All right, and so you concur with Mr. Abrams' changes to the draft, except you have a question about whether or not to allow in R1.
Strike the exception. That's the only that doesn't really 100% make sense.
you think about the draft.
I would agree also that there's no um, there's no reason to strike through the R1 provisions entirely. A lot of the other red line things talk about the substituting the word legal process for judgment. I really don't think that's a big deal. There's also a red line talking about um, compliance with fire codes and so forth and so on. I don't see any issue with that. The only other issue that I see is striking through the comments about parking, solid waste, so forth and so on, being subject to subdivision rules. I don't think that should be stricken from the record because those people that live in Hickory Mountain Estates, they do have covenants on file, and those covenants should be maintained, and those are already documented, and anything that we do with respect to short-term rentals should not supersede those documents.
Mr. Newsom,
Yes.
I forgot what you wanted to talk about now. What was
That's okay. I'm a little concerned about enforcement and how is that going to be handled? Other than that, I have no other problems with it. I think that's an important part of it. Making sure that that's handled properly.
the other thing you want to brought up? I forgot. Does anybody know?
I mentioned the worries about infrastructure.
Oh, the infrastructure,
Yeah, but that's not a great concern. I mean, but it's an issue.
Unfortunately, I think the infrastructure all over town needs
Yeah.
a little rehab.
Well, the point is that the more traffic we have and the more usage adds to that condition. So
Anything else?
that would be it.
Barbara Rice.
It's still an open meeting.
Well,
But anyway, that's.
Sorry, Mike.
question on it.
Covenant was for us to establish if which one supersedes. Finalize that before we make any decisions.
One thing I forgot to do is that there was a letter that came from a part-time resident, Kirk Warren, that expressed an opinion. And I don't want to read the whole two-page letter, but some of the comments he made in his letter that are appropriate. I think he says in his letter, I am opposed to any short-term rentals within the land classification of R1. My opposition extends to proposed as well as grandfathered rights to those individuals who wish to rent or to continue to rent their properties on the mountain. Further down in his third paragraph at the end, he says short-term rentals and other eroding land classifications will only diminish the quality and integrity of our home sites. And another comment I made, or that I highlighted, I thought were appropriate. He writes, I have not witnessed one instance in which short-term rentals have ever increased the integrity, the land value, or safety of the subject property. And in his final paragraph, I highlighted the phrase he said, one only can expect the degradation of the tranquility of life that will result due to the increased traffic, increased response from public safety, including fire, the general inclination, quality of the area. So again, we can't question Mr. Warren about this, but I thought that his written comments appropriate to this issue. Another comment I wanted to make is that I think that this ordinance that we're looking at right now does a lot to provide for the public health and safety of our community. It limits occupancy in these short-term vacation rentals. It insists on compliance with building and fire code. It provides regulations for parking and sanitation and fire and smoke alarms and egress into rooms and pet management. And I think it provides for the general welfare of the overall community in that it prohibits short-term vacation rentals in sensitive land or flood hazard areas. The ordinance as it exists right now doesn't even prevent short-term rentals in those areas. And it also provides for a local contact person, not some company in another state, be within 2 hours to respond to any problems or complaints. And it does, in my opinion, this draft provide for sanctions against those who violate the rules and regulations that we're proposing. Regarding R1, we've had this debate in January, and that time I remember there was no board member nor any person from the public who wanted short-term vacation rentals R1 or residential areas, and we took a vote. That was our very first vote regarding this issue.
And I thought we had that. And I thought we had that settled.
Well, I did too.
Now here we are, and that's why I'm confused about it, because I thought we had that settled.
But we didn't. That was not actually a public hearing. There were people in the audience spoke up and had an opinion about that, but it was not the official public.
Oh, that's not public? I'm asking. I'm new to this stuff. So if they just come and it's not designated a public hearing, then it's not a public hearing.
Yeah, I think this is the public hearing, and we had one opposed and one for it.
Okay. The one in January, I thought we had that settled about. And now
My issue with the R1 is how it contradicts with the covenants. We need to be able to clarify the distinguishing factor between strictly R1 and R1 in areas where there are covenants. There has to be some kind of specific separation of the two. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to have one or the other.
well, and which one overrides the other? And
Exactly.
and legally, not just
Exactly.
my opinion of what I'm reading, but legally, technically, which one overrides?
That's my point. You need to have the legal definition of whether it's strictly R1 or if it's an R1 area with covenants, or there needs to be that distinction somehow.
That's why I think we need to get see the covenant, get the attorney, and then to answer that question.
answer to that question might be, I'm just thinking out loud, is that in a subdivision where there are covenants, the covenants can't be less restrictive than the city ordinance, but could possibly be more restrictive if they're reasonable. For example, if the city ordinance prohibits short-term vacation rentals in R1 districts, I don't think covenants can override that and say, oh, well, we're going to allow them here. I don't think. But say if the covenants said something like, your property's got to be painted for 3 or 4 years, that would be more restrictive, and I don't think that would violate the city ordinance, or not violate, but be contradict the city ordinance. So I guess what I'm saying is that covenants can't be less restrictive than the city ordinance, but could possibly be more restrictive. If there's a homeowners association that, say, wanted everyone's mailbox to be painted green, I think that would be more restrictive, but I don't think it would violate the city ordinance.
Well, man, I think we should get a copy and read it, and then, as I said, to get the attorney.
I got a copy right here.
Of the covenant.
I
haven't
thought I
ever seen
printed
it.
everything.
They're very old, like Christie said, they're from 1985. And they've never been updated or renewed or rewritten or anything. And basically, frankly, there needs to be a homeowners association that update those covenants and enforce them.
But are they not enforceable because they haven't been updated?
I don't think so.
I think there's a time limit that they have to be reviewed and
Well, I think it
Maybe
says they
mistaken,
renew every
but-
10 years if a homeowners association presses it automatically.
Then that would say to me that if that's the word. Yes, then it's not.
Well, we could add in our ordinance that we intend to send to the city council that any covenants that are established by a homeowner that are more restrictive to be enforced, but less restricted than the city ordinance prevails. So is the question then, how do estate covenants impact R1?
yes.
Now,
And Ben, what happened to our recommendation in January about R1? That there would be no short-term rentals in R1. I thought that was set. I've said this before, but I thought that was settled, established. We presented it to the council, and didn't they pass that?
well, and that's why it's written into this draft. Mr. Irvin and his, are objecting to that particular statement, and right in a few moments, I hope that we're going to vote and vote on whether or not to send this draft to the city council tomorrow for their workshop or make major revisions. And to be honest with you, if we say that we're going to recommend to the city council that short-term vacation rentals be allowed in R1 districts, then there is going to be a lot of people who object to that. Yeah.
For sure.
I don't know any. Sure, there's some, but
And we got to keep in mind too, that the current moratorium expires the 1st of August. Now, the city council's already had their June meeting. They are gonna have a workshop tomorrow, but they've only have, one more meeting in July, have their public meeting on this ordinance, whatever they come up with and find. Then that moratorium is going to be over, and anyone can apply for short-term vacation rental anywhere in the city.
Extend the moratorium.
Now, they probably can, but I don't know if they can do that indefinitely. We've already extended that moratorium twice. All right, now I was going to look at Mr. Adams' other recommendations in 2204, number 1. I personally think that needs to stay there. It refers to a section, actually the old section of the ordinance. That's going to be section 2204, number 1. Adam struck through that. I think that needs to stay in. It does refer to the section in the city ordinance that's already established regarding applications and taxes and fees and consequences if one fails to pay. So I think that needs to stay in there. Where he talks about the bedroom occupancy standard in section 2205, number E, occupancy. I think that maybe instead of putting bedroom occupancy standard, which the Housing Urban Development recommends 2 persons per room, we could simply say limited to 4 persons per bedroom. I know that seems like a lot.
But my issue with that would be that maybe if it's 4 persons per bedroom and they have numerous bedrooms there, that the state of Georgia fire code, that might be more people than the fire code allows.
This was probably.
Well, that's true. So we could say 4 persons per bedroom and compliance with the state of Georgia fire and safety code. 2 to a bedroom.
Well, if you have bunk beds, if you have bunk beds in a room,
I don't
Yeah.
think that's enforceable. I think,
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Ooh, excuse me.
The
I
state
don't
of
know how
Georgia
you
fire and
enforce
safety
that.
code regulations are enforceable by law. The bedroom occupancy, I don't.
And how do you enforce it?
All right, so you agree with striking that and just put in under the state of Georgia fire and safety code regulations? Any comment?
I agree with
I
that.
do too.
Okay.
I also just above that, I also suggest that we do not strike the term subdivision rules.
Okay.
Because that's been part of our discussion for half of the evening, so it should stay there.
All right, I agree with that. And in this next one, regarding solid waste, B, he struck through subdivision rules and put any law. Maybe it should say subdivision rules in any other state, local, or federal law, something like that.
I would agree with that.
Now, what do you think about, section 2206, number A, where he has struck through, legal process and put legal judgment? That was my question. Um, Can a, operator of a short-term vacation rental be allowed to continue to rent that property even if there's some legal proceeding filed against them? And wait until a court enters a judgment or there's a settlement? What do you think?
I think that that would be correct. That a legal process starts when somebody has a complaint. You can make a complaint if somebody you don't like does something and you complain against them, that could automatically start a legal process. And there may be no basis to it. So you can tell me that you're going to revoke somebody's license just because somebody that may not like them has a problem with them and starts a legal process.
But again, it might be.
But it may be something as much as, oh, your dog came onto my lawn, defecated on my lawn, and I'm mad, so I'm going to make a complaint against you and have you arrested.
I agree with you. There could be trivial, frivolous complaints that create a big
I
problem.
think it should wait for a judgment because that's going to be a court of law saying, okay, we have looked at all of this evidence and we are making this judgment. So it's verifiably. If it's your dog and your neighbor says that they're coming into their yard and they threaten to sue you, and your license would be revoked for something because your neighbor sued you, and that may be your livelihood. I'm just saying that without an actual judgment, it could be a verifiable problem, or it could be just an assumed problem.
But by the time the thing is adjudicated, the person who's causing the problem will be long gone. The very first paragraph in that particular section, 2206, states immediate suspension, revocation, or forfeiture of a short-term vacation license.
I'm just using that as an example because this is based on bankruptcy and receivership and levy of judgment. It's not necessarily I'm going to sue you because your dog defecated in my yard kind of a thing. I'm just using that as an example of how frivolous some things can be. If you say that you're going to do this during a legal process, there hasn't been any kind of witness that something took place. There's no judgment in a court of law. It's just one person saying something against another person. And if you revoke somebody's business license based on those descriptions, then you're going to be setting yourself up for another lawsuit because you have invaded or encroached upon their rights.
I don't
But
think,
again, how long does the judgment take?
Well, it takes as long as it takes, but
I mean, like.
I don't think the use of the word judgment, in my opinion, is a problem because, as Van mentioned in the previous paragraph, there are other provisions to revoke a license. And that's at the authority of the city council. So that can be done regardless of a judgment. So to include that language in section A really addresses bankruptcy. Basically, it's financial matters is what it boils down to. So,
Well, you think this is finance?
well, it talks about bankruptcy, receivership, or levy of judgment, you know, that could mean a lien on the property or whatever, but the first paragraph specifically talks about the city of Tallulah Falls or the town of Tallulah Falls being able to revoke a license or suspend it based on a recommendation from the city council. So I think we're covered either way, and striking through the words legal process and then putting the word judgment in there, I don't think really
What if we
matters a whole lot.
did something like this, and instead of saying shall be immediately revoked, say could result in immediate revocation in the case of bankruptcy, following a hearing before the city council? That would be their chance to, argue frivolous lawsuit. Instead of saying shall, you could say can be revoked after after a hearing before the city council. It couldn't be revoked immediately, but after a hearing before the city council, they could have the opportunity or the right to revoke a license if someone goes into bankruptcy. It could take quite a long time, over a year or more.
So you're talking about section A.
Uh, Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Instead of saying shall, make it can, and after a hearing in front of the city council.
Okay, but we're leaving the first paragraph in as written.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Does anyone else have any comment about the draft? Now, on the very last page, 22, adding 2209, license reinstatement. Does anybody want to have any problem with that provision?
I do not.
I'm okay with it.
Okay. Let's talk a minute about R1. In a moment, we're going to have a vote on whether or not to send this draft to the city council's workshop tomorrow, or rewrite the whole thing and have another hearing. So we're talking about right now allowing short-term vacation rentals in R1 or residential areas. Tressa, yes or no?
I don't think it's, I think that we can send this to council and say, this is what we recommend, and put the little note with it about what we had talked about, instead of having to rewrite the whole thing. Just say, this is our recommendation with this substitution possibly, because ultimately it's going to be city council.
So how should it read then?
I think it should keep with the exception of R1 in there, with the caveat that more investigation needs to be done on that
Covenant?
on the covenant.
So your question is,
I still haven't read the covenant. I don't know what they say, so I cannot speak on authority of what the covenant has in it. So I can't say, okay, just include all R1, because I don't know what that covenant says. I can't make a recommendation based on something that I'm not familiar with.
I do have a copy. It basically says that, the covenants that cover Hickory Nut Mountain Estates, state that the homes there are for single-family residents only and no commercial activity. So the covenants actually prohibit short-term vacation rentals, in my opinion, in the Hickory Nut Mountain Estates.
Like, there again, like I said, once it goes to city council, they're gonna review it also, and they're gonna get the city attorney involved, and they will go over this. So if we say that we recommend it as is, with the note to the side that they need to verify the distinguishment between just strictly R1 and covenants, then they're gonna do the research that they need to do to make it legal.
The comment, yeah, we're just the recommending authority. They are the deciding authority.
That's all we're doing anyway, though, right?
Yeah, making the
So-
recommendation.
Make a recommendation.
I recommend we leave it exactly as it is, and if the city council reviews section 2203 and they say that there's a covenant issue and they kick it back to us, then we can review it at that time, but I think we should submit a firm response to the city council and let them make that decision, personally.
I agree with that. I think that's a good plan.
What do you think?
Okay, so what we're saying here, we're going to send it to the council.
Yes.
They want it tomorrow night.
Well, I know, but this is very important.
Sure,
Tomorrow
yeah.
night, we shouldn't be
It's
rushed.
not
and
very
neither-
important.
and neither should they. So I don't like sending this, hoping they are going to review covenant, review the R.
So I'm confused.
So I would
Yes.
send this, I would not send it.
And
Because
the
I
re-
would first want, and then send it to the county. Whatever came out of the covenant. Include. I don't think we send it to the whole thing, they don't. Because if they accept this, then they will be.
So you're saying you agree that, short-term vacation rentals should possibly be allowed in residential areas?
No, I am saying no,
You don't want them,
I don't want them there.
you don't want them in R1 or residential?
Yes,
areas?
now, I would agree to, short-term rental business area.
Okay.
Okay, that I would agree to, but not in residential. I do not agree with that. And with this, the R1, time, that in January, I thought it was set. There would be no, short-term rental.
I think
Hickory
that's
Nut
what we're,
Mountain Or anywhere, yes, the other zoning areas, there would be. I thought that was that.
that,
It's never gone to council.
And
Yeah.
what did but didn't they agree to that? The council.
The council has
No.
never heard it. I mean, it's not our recommendation. We have not sent our recommendation to
Oh,
council.
I thought we did.
Did not.
That was our first order of business, that we took a vote on what districts to allow short-term vacation
Yeah.
rental. And what we voted on and all agreed to unanimously is that short-term vacation rentals should be allowed in all districts except
Right.
R1.
That I
Flood
agree
hazard
with,
and
and that I
situation.
agree with, but to send this to council and hope.
Well,
everybody
that's what this is saying. That we, as planning and zoning, are recommending that they not allow R1
Oh, I
flood
missed-
hazard or
That's what you
sensitive
want.
land. Is that not
Where
what you
is
want?
that? Where, I missed.
Section 2203 on the very first page, section
2203.
2203. the,
That's it.
the very first line. Permitted uses STVRs are allowed in all districts with the exception of R1, flood hazard or sensitive land.
Okay, I would agree with that.
That's what we're
Okay,
sending to
so-
council.
So that's what we are saying,
Yes.
and these other edits that we made, that would be really applied.
The red line, the red line that is here is not our proposed changes, it's what the lawyer. So, yeah, so
Okay, let me read this. It's,
that's
gonna
his,
know
no,
when-
they're not getting that copy. They're not getting the copy that's got all the red marks through it. That's not the one that we are submitting. That's the one that the attorney submitted to us for consideration. The one that the city council will get that will not have any of the red lines. It'll just be a straight proposal.
Will,
Now I'm getting clear.
okay.
I'm sorry, guys. I'm not.
Well, it's better to be clear about it
Yes.
than question it and do something that you really don't want to do because you're questioning.
I missed
And
that.
I-
Okay, Ben. Now ask me.
Then I'm going to make a motion that we send this draft to the city council as written with the following, changes. On the first page, I'm recommending that no change. On the second page, under section 2205, in 2205, section B regarding solid waste and trash, we are going to add, we're going to include subdivision rules in any local, state, or federal law.
Agreed.
In number E in section 2205 regarding occupancy, are we going to say, we're going to say occupancy in compliance with the state of Georgia fire and safety code regulations and leave out the phrase bedroom occupancy standard +2. Does everybody agree with that?
Agreed.
Yes.
Yes.
In section 2206, number A, what we're going to do is change that to say any short-term vacation rental license issued under this ordinance for the operation of a short-term vacation rental can be immediately revoked in the case of bankruptcy, receivership, or levy of legal process after review by the city council, we say. And we agree with Mr. Adams' inclusion of section 2209 regarding the reinstatement of a license upon payment of full of any fine and penalties. Everybody agree with that?
Agreed.
Yes.
So my motion is that we send this draft to the city council tomorrow with those revisions I just spelled out. I made that motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All right, well, Mr. Stan seconded it. All right, all those in favor of sending the ordinance to the city council that, with the revisions we just made, please signify by raising your hand. All right, all unanimous. All right, that concludes that item on the agenda. The The next item on the agenda, number 5, is the zoning map amendment. The zoning map is outside. I think. There, right, Mr. Early has it up on that. And I don't know if you had a chance to do that. Linda sent us all a copy. We're going to have a public hearing on that. And what I'm going to ask at this time is that, is there anyone out there who is in favor of the draft map that is proposed that would like to come in and speak to the council? Anyone out in the Bay Area, in the Fire Bay? Is anybody out there at all? These masks are hot. All right, I guess not. Is there anybody online electronically? We got one. Okay, we got one out in the bay. Who wants to speak in favor? Mr. Irvin. We're talking now about the proposed map. Understanding that.
I'm confused about that.
Is anybody else out there? We were talking about people who are in favor of it. Anybody in favor of it? We have one more? All right. Christy, we're talking about, are you in favor or object to the?
I am in
proposed map?
favor of the proposed map and keeping Hickory Nut Mountain residential and adding it in. For the same reasons from before, with the road being not up to standards, wide enough to allow business and commercial traffic to come up through that area safely for the residents that live in that mountain.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. That's everyone out in the Bay Area. Is that correct, Ms. Edwards? Starting the map. Is there anybody online electronically that would like to speak on behalf of recommending that this draft go to the city council? Is there anybody opposed?
Well, in favor, since there's no place on the agenda for I'll jump in as in favor. I did send a couple of editorial things about wording for multifamily rather than two-family, and a couple of questions. There's some cleanup things like the Y camps are being shown as residential, but that's not something we can deal with at this process. But map's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Nell. That's a good question, the Y camp. I don't have an answer for that one. Anybody got a comment? Or anyone have any questions to anyone, Mr. Irvin or Mr. Nellens or Christie or anyone else? Okay, I'm going to close the public hearing part on the proposed official map of Tallulah Falls, zoning map of Tallulah Falls, and now it's time for us to discuss this amongst ourselves. I do remember that there was something said about improving the road, but the city council has already took us under. You know, we're already part of the city. What we're trying to do is just clean up the map. Newsom, do you remember what you were pretty instrumental in all of that? What happened to the road clause? Do you have?
That goes way back, and there was a meeting, I'm sure there are minutes from it, where it was accepted into the town. So It should be official.
Yeah, I seem to remember that the town just, I think there was also a request that the water department, the water system be upgraded, but the town accepted us into the city anyway, and in fact, the town had been providing services to our little estate, Hickory Nut Mountain anyway,
Yes.
and
Oh, 2007? Yeah. I can't either. I have a record of it all.
The annexation was in 2004, and it was annexed in as single-family residential, but the map has not been updated to show the annexation or the single family. So we just need to add it to the map. It's already been zoned single family.
yet they weren't paying taxes. They were already providing, they're already providing services, they were
Yes.
fixing our water, and we weren't paying any city taxes, but now they're getting our tax money every year. So they accepted us anyway. So I'm going to ask for a motion to recommend that this draft go to the city council the way it is right now. Do anyone want to make that motion?
I just have one question. Maybe it'd be good if I just came up there and. So I know that that section of the map is basically the Tallulah Railroad, right? I understand it.
I didn't hear your question, Stan.
He's asking if that little section was part of the Tallulah Falls Railroad.
Railroad Street.
Yes,
Street,
it's
yes,
Railroad
I'm sorry.
Street, but it's
Sorry.
not.
So, yeah, I didn't mean to.
That's-
it was part of the- So, you have this piece of, commercial property wedged in between two residential properties, and I've been up that road before. I don't see any evidence of commercial activity unless I just missed it. So what would be the reason for us to throw right in the middle of an R1 district a commercial section of property?
Well, I personally think that you would really be opening up a can of worms.
I'm just asking the question. I'm not saying.
Can I comment on that?
Go ahead, Keith.
Yes. Well, I think it's the same thing Tress is about to say, and correct me if my folklore is wrong, but Wayne Harris had intended that to be a set of cabins for ashram retreats, and that had been rezoned so that that could be the same type of single family type residences that we were talking about earlier as rental property, and that's a good area for that since it's already zoned, and I think the urban zone it, but I think that's historical back 20 or 30 years. Tries to correct me where I'm wrong.
So-
You're correct. Wayne Harris did rezone that property with the intention of building cabins for short-term rentals. And he went into bankruptcy before that came to fruition.
So that is not a change
Correct.
No,
to the
that's-
map. That's just the way it was
actual-
before.
That's actual, the way that it is zoned at this time.
Okay, I'm fine with that.
Um,
That's 30.
there's, the full plot is 6, and that's part of the issue that David has with annexing in Hickory Nut Mountain. Hickory Nut Mountain was part of the county when that rezoning took place. Therefore, the section of property that he owns on Hickory Nut Mountain is not zoned commercial. when Johnny and David bought that property, Wayne Harris or whoever owned it at that time sold it with the understanding to them that the entire piece of property was zoned business. That was not the case because the section that was out in the county was never rezoned.
I don't think there's any problem with that being commercial.
Not for the intended purpose that he wanted, because he was wanting to put cabins in and do short-term rentals. I mean, that borders my property. I don't have an issue with that. I don't. No, because it is a commercial piece of property. It's business property and zoned as such, use it as such. But don't expand that business property into the rest of the residential property.
Okay, Stan, do you have any objection to that?
No, I have no issues. My main question was, is this an existing condition or is this a change? And if it's an existing condition, then I vote we accept it as is. Okay, so we're not recommending any.
This piece of property zoned in this map, it was R1, and that's what the school is, middle school.
Okay.
All right, could I get a motion to recommend that this draft be accepted by the city council? Does anyone make that motion? All right, Barbara Rice made that motion. Do I not see a second?
I'll make a second.
Stan's gonna second that. All in favor of sending this map to city council, raise their hand. Okay, we'll do that. Okay, the last order of business, number 6, is that my term ends next month. And we're gonna need someone to replace me. And if any of you have an idea or know of a citizen who would be willing to sit on this board, we could include a recommendation to the city council that person be considered. Does anyone have anyone in mind or working with anyone?
There's no chance you'd re-up, right?
No, I'm retiring from public life.
Trust me, I'm with you.
I'm gonna be a person of leisure up in my.
Oh.
Christie said she would entertain it.
Really?
Yes. Christy, the lady that's been in.
Oh, yeah?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Send her in.
All right. I'll include then a letter to the city council that she be considered to serve on the board. And you guys are gonna have to elect a chairman, probably in August.
And the vice chair.
Yeah, and vice chair. And I don't know if you may be tired of being secretary. I don't know. So, all that will have to be decided. All right. Do I hear a motion to adjourn this meeting? Anybody want to make that a motion?
Let's talk to Christy. Wasn't she coming in? Let's talk to
Did
Christy.
you want to come and say something? Christy, you're on. Go.
You have to tell her why she's here.
Yeah.
Oh, we were going to submit a written request that you be considered by the city council to serve on this planning and zoning board. Are you okay with that?
I'd be very okay with that.
All right, well, I'm going to include a letter that.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Mr. Adams, thanks for your input. Mr. Nelms, thank you for your input. And can I hear a motion to adjourn this meeting? All right, Stan is going to Make a motion. Do I hear a second? Do I see a second? Barbara's going to second it. All those in favor of adjournment, raise their hand. This June 10th meeting is adjourned.
Hey.